We're thankful for the summer recording workshop sponsored by the University of North Carolina for filling in for us this morning. Eugene Peterson, in his translation paraphrase of the Bible titled The Message, has an often insightful, sometimes playful way of communicating the text. And in Psalm 42:3, the psalm that we just sang together, in verse 3, he has a wonderful way of communicating the feeling of the psalmist in that word. He says, I'm on a diet of tears. Tears for breakfast. Tears for supper. Do you ever feel like that? Have you ever felt like that? Are you feeling like that now? It is a reality of life. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. Oftentimes it's accompanied by literal tears. Sometimes it's not. Some of us are criers and some of us aren't. But we all at some point find our place similar to that of Elijah in the text that Rex just read for us this morning. I want to spend just a few moments this morning talking about the reasons that we get to that place. Not because naming them gets rid of it, but sometimes putting names and words to it helps us put it in a compartment, in a box. And then to spend a few moments on how are we healed from those challenging moments of life. Tears for breakfast, tears for supper. Why do we end up there sometimes? One of the reasons that we end up there is because of affliction. Sometimes things happen to us that cause us pain that we have no control over. So one of the reasons for that pain is affliction. We're diagnosed with a disease. The report comes back is positive. Something happens to us. We're on the highway and we get rear-ended and set and string a whole line of things that we have to take care of. We have relationships that are hurt and that cause us pain. There are things that happen to us which can sometimes bring tears. I learned that over the past several weeks as I had an affliction myself, and I finally went to the doctor for a wound that wasn't healing on my foot. And the doctor wouldn't touch it, but sent me straight to the hospital. I had an affliction, and there was no amount of positive thinking, no amount of creative problem solving, no amount of negotiating with the doctor, the jerk, no amount of working a little bit harder that was going to fix that problem. So off to the hospital I went. And I sat in my car for a little bit in between. And guess what I had for lunch that day? Some tears. Thinking about everything that was going to happen and the insurance deductible and the commitments that I wasn't going to be able to meet and having to go to the hospital for something so stupid that could have been avoided. I was afflicted. Things were outside of my control. Much like Elijah in the wilderness, he found himself afflicted. We get in that place sometimes because of affliction. We get in that place sometimes out of oppression. Things that come against us, both from within and from without. Elijah was being chased by Ahab and Jezebel because of his victory against the prophets of Baal. In addition, there seems to be some depression that overtook him from within and oppressed him. The demoniac in the Gospel of Luke was oppressed by something. The Bible describes it as being possessed by demons. In our modern materialistic world, we're really quick to set that aside. And I don't know that I believe in the existence of actual demons, but I know that I've encountered people that are possessed by something. Whether it be mental illness or depression, just something that comes against them, addiction that just seems to take over. And many of you, and probably most of us at some point in our points of relationship, have experienced someone that has been true of. It just comes upon us, and we're oppressed from within. Oftentimes, as well, we're oppressed from without. Really interesting word that's used in this interaction between Jesus and the one that was possessed. Jesus talks to the demon and says, "What is your name?" The demon's response is, "My name is Legion." Scripture goes on to describe that because there were a lot of them. But that's a really specific word. Legion. You know what that word is in the Greek? Legion. Do you know what happens when you look up the word legion in the Bible dictionary? And not just some dirty liberal Bible dictionary, any Bible dictionary. You're given the definition of that word as a unit of infantry in the Roman military of 6,000 men. Lots of words that could have been used there: mob, gang. The gospel writer chose legion in a book that was written to and for and during the Roman occupation of the area. The oppression oftentimes comes from the outside. You know, we get in these places sometimes where nothing seems to be going right, and it's easy to get in the place and say, "Oh, what are all the things that I'm screwing up and I'm doing wrong?" And sometimes there are some of those things. But we also live in a world of injustice. We live in a world of oppression. We live in a world where life is made more difficult for others than it need be. And then sometimes those things all combine. So we're afflicted, we're oppressed from within, we're possessed with ailments and difficulties, and then we're getting it from the outside as well. Could there be another way? We get in those places of pain and tears because of affliction, because of oppression, and sometimes because of frustration. Elijah was a prophet called by God to stand up to Ahab and Jezebel. And just as an aside, we always need to put Ahab and Jezebel together. Jezebel has gotten a little bit of a worse rap than Ahab does, but they're in this together, and Scripture does that, and tradition does that, because if you have the choice of blaming a man or a woman, you might as well blame the woman, right? But Ahab was just as much a partner in this oppression and this idolatry as Jezebel was. And so Elijah came against them, came against the prophets of Baal, and as Rex reminded us, was incredibly successful in that endeavor, calling down fire from heaven that consumed the sacrifice and everything around it. But my goodness, as soon as Elijah had that success, the forces of idolaters came against him. That is what happens every time the truth of God is spoken prophetically against those that would chase after idols. And so you might think, well, thank God I'm not a prophet. Well, I have some bad news. We're prophets. As followers of Jesus, as followers of the way, we are called to speak for God and with God to a world that would seek to chase after idols. So you might not be on TV predicting the end of the world or selling dehydrated food in buckets, but you're a prophet. Look at what Walter Brueggemann says. The prophetic task of the church are to tell the truth in a society that lives in illusion, grieve in a society that practices denial, and express hope in a society that lives in despair. That is our calling. First Congregational United Church of Christ of Lake Worth, that is our calling together. The idols aren't called Baal anymore. They're called gross domestic product, S&P 500, border security, American exceptionalism. Are those things necessarily bad? No. And the intertwining of them definitely affects our life. But when we fall down on our face before them, as we do as a society time and time again, they become idols. So we lift our voices and we speak against them. We engage in work that confronts those issues. And sometimes we're successful. A lot of times we're not. And it's frustrating. And we want to throw our hands up and say, well, why do we do this? Why do we bother? And it's so easy to fall into despair. Affliction, oppression, frustration, and finally, isolation. Do you hear what Elijah's complaint is when he finally has audience with God? Here's what he says. I have been zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left. Have you been there? I've been there, usually once a week or so. So we face affliction, we face oppression, we face frustration, and we spiral down and spiral down and spiral down until we say, I'm the only one that gives a darn. Where is everyone else? And we separate ourselves, from other people, from God. And I think that's kind of usually, often, where we hit the bottom. So those are the reasons that we find ourselves in that place. How do we find the moments of healing? And so if one of the major causes is isolation, then I understand that one of the paths of healing, one of the moments of healing is connection. Just connecting. With whom do we connect? We connect with ourselves first. And you might, well, that sounds crazy. I'm connected to myself. I'm me. And yet, I don't know about you, but so often I find myself disconnected from myself. And hundreds of psychologists and spiritual teachers have taught about that over the course of history. I don't think anyone matches Paul from Romans chapter 6, where he says, the things I do want to do, I don't do. And the things I don't want to do, I do. What is wrong with me? I think disconnection from ourselves looks different for each of us. One of the ways it looks for me, I was just remembering this recently, is sitting in the parking lot of a gas station with a diabetic-induced wound on my foot, eating gas station pizza and Little Debbie fudge rounds, and thumbing through my social media to find something that will outrage me or titillate me, or someone that I can be jealous of because of their success. That's what disconnection looks like for me, and I apologize. I know that makes us uncomfortable to hear those kind of things about our pastor. But this is humanity. This is life. So connecting to ourselves, and what connection looks like for me is taking time specifically and intentionally during the day to check in to see how I'm feeling and check in to see how I'm behaving. Is how I'm behaving connected with how I'm feeling? Am I doing what I want to do, or have I gone off mechanically on some tangent that might be harmful for me and others? We connect with ourselves. We connect with our circumstances and our surroundings. We take a step back and look. For Elijah, that happened in the wilderness. It happened in nature, and it often happens there. Now, we're told God wasn't in the earthquake or in the fire or in the wind, but my goodness, those things must have been preparing Elijah's heart and soul for the silence that was to come. Are we paying attention? I had the experience just a few days ago. I'm in and out of Good Samaritan Hospital all the time because we have an inpatient unit. Vitas Hospice has an inpatient unit there. And there's a little chapel on the first floor. You've probably walked by it because it's right on the way to the elevators. And that door is always open, and it's a really nice chapel. But this particular day, the door was closed. And I was walking down the hall, a really nice hospital hall with everything clean, everything nice and crisp. The signs have sans serif fonts on them, so they're even clean and very sterile. And yet I walked by the closed door of the chapel, in all of its ornateness and beauty and organicness. In the middle of this sterile environment, this little photo of beauty. Are we paying attention to those things that we encounter? Connection with our circumstances and what's going on around us. Are we connecting with God? That's a path of healing. After the earthquake, after the fire, after the wind, there was silence. And from that silence, God spoke to Elijah. God passed by, protecting Elijah, keeping God's hand on Elijah, but drawing near to Elijah. It's so often in the wilderness where God becomes present. Usually we don't like to be in the wilderness. Usually we're forced into the wilderness by our circumstances or how we're feeling or this pain that we're feeling. But it is in the wilderness where God draws near. Not the God that we learned about in Sunday school. Not the God that the preacher talks about. Not the God that everybody says you're supposed to believe in. But the God that draws near. The God whose hand protects us. The God who whispers to us in the silence. We don't like to be in the wilderness, but that's where God speaks. We can choose to go into the wilderness with spiritual practices, and sometimes we're forced, and it's a painful experience, but if we can reframe that to be able to understand that as we're going into the wilderness, we are guaranteed at some point an encounter with the divine, the ground of all being. We connect with God. We connect with others. Do you see what God's response is to Elijah in this passage? Go and anoint, and I don't remember their names, so-and-so the king of Israel, so-and-so the king of Judah, the two kingdoms. Go and anoint Elisha, another prophet, as your successor. And by the way, Elijah, there are still 7,000 people in Israel that have not bowed their knee to Baal. There are others out there. We are never absolutely alone. We have faith communities. We have friends in whom we can find safety and to share and be together. Sometimes that's not enough for what we're dealing with. And so there are professionals who we can employ and engage that will sit with us and listen to us and guide us through that which afflicts us and oppresses us and frustrates us. They will offer a path through the isolation. And it's such an incredible realization. I love this quote from Henry Nouwen, who writes about connection and relationship all the time. Those who are not afraid to hold a hand in gratitude, to shed tears of grief, and to let a sigh of distress arise straight from the heart, witness the birth of a new fellowship, the fellowship of the broken. The fellowship of the broken. Not the fellowship of the people that have to fake it in order to be accepted by each other, but the fellowship of the broken, together in our brokenness. A path of healing is connection in all those ways. A path of healing is action. God is willing to be present with Elijah in the difficult times. And then God says, Elijah, we need to get busy. Go do what it is that prophets do. Continue to be a voice. Continue to connect those 7,000 people that have not bowed their knee to Baal. Continue to go anoint people. Go do what you're called to do. I don't know about you, but when I find myself in those wilderness painful experiences, sometimes, not always and not solely, but sometimes it's a matter of just going about what it is that we are to be about. Not in a frantic needing to get it done, but because it's our action that makes a difference in ourselves and in the world. I've been reading a book by Brad Stolberg called On Groundedness, the practice of groundedness. And I love an idea that he has in that book. He says, goals are great. Set your goals. They're wonderful. But don't worship the goals. Look at the goals. See what actions are needed to fulfill those goals. And then set the goal aside and engage those actions. The action, the behaviors, the practices that will get us where we need to go. Fellowship of the broken, fellow wilderness sojourners. Might we connect with ourselves, with the planet, with our God, and with each other.